Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and my guest today is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Whoa, whoa. Well, I'll pop. Here I am. There we go.
Okay, great. Great to see you,
The gremlins are here too, I guess.
Jonathan.
So
Oh,
glad to be here as always.
well, listen, we are watching a very interesting show how Trump makes peace between Russia and Ukraine. It's a fantastic show. There are a billion people are watching this show, and
They
so
just can't take their eyes off it.
yeah, absolutely. People go to bed with thoughts about this, what's going to happen next, and they wake up in the morning and check their news sources and the internet and everything else. And what, in your opinion, how does it look? What do you really think about all that?
Well, what's some of my colleagues have referred to this as President Trump playing a game of multi-dimensional chess, which has some merits to it. What I would say is he is trying to use the economic lever and the economic and tariff lever as a way of indirectly affecting the military lever and the military political situation. The threat of if now that he has gotten Ukraine to agree to his portion of the conditions for a ceasefire, now they're putting the ball in Russia's court, applying pressure there, and in this case, Putin's refusal to compromise is now working against him because now that it motivates and incentivizes the European allies of Ukraine as well as puts pressure on Russia. They will face sanctions, and Ukraine is free to continue its military operations to reduce Russia's ability to continue its offensive.
By the way, it does exactly that
And in interest in
very successfully.
and yes, they are, and we have seen recent reports of major refineries being blown up, and other things which are indirectly the effect is somewhat delayed because it's not a direct strike against the front lines against the military forces, although the Ukrainian forces are still exacting superior casualties against Russia because they're increasingly being forced to resort to infantry attacks and not really capable of executing a mechanized offensive. And their capacity to supply their forces is also steadily decreasing, as we have witnessed. Where they're now using donkeys as well as other, less sophisticated means of supplying their forces. Logistics has always been a weak point of the Russian armed forces, and it was only because as I've stated before, because the United States helped make up for Russia's deficiency in mechanized logistics during World War II, that Russia was eventually able to drive the Nazis out of Russia, out of the Soviet Union. But now that they don't have that, and now that the Ukrainians are taking advantage of their ability to inflict deep strikes on Russia's logistics infrastructure and their energy infrastructure, it is having a steadily increasing effect on Russia's ability to continue the offensive. And it is approaching the point where Russia will not be able to make any more progress offensively at all. And that is what Clausewitz would call the culminating point, where they have reached their maximum extent and where logically a defender who has been conserving his resources can then inflict a decisive counteroffensive. And again, as I've stated numerous times on this program, I contend that the true center of gravity is the Crimea, and that if the Ukraine can husband its resources and choose its moment for a decisive counterattack when they sense and perceive that Russia can no longer continue the offensive, then the opportunity will exist for Ukraine to take its destiny firmly into its own hands and inflict a decisive counterattack.
Very interesting, Jonathan. I would like to mention something that when you were saying that perhaps Trump is playing multidimensional chess of some kind. So, multidimensional chess, in my opinion, it's several games which are playing in very different levels, somewhat
Mhm.
higher, somewhat lower, and somewhat backwards, and somewhat like real multidimensional. Let's take one dimensional at the time, and then we will arrive at multidimensional level.
Fair
One
enough.
at the time. Okay. Uh, is Trump's goal by far is creating a peace in Ukraine? I have some doubts about that, and I'll tell you why. Because although at the beginning, when he was saying that he will make a peace in 24 hours or so, he didn't have any strategy whatsoever. He was
Yeah.
just talking. Okay, later on, I think he developed himself or with his assistants a plan where he would agree both sides to 1 month ceasefire, and during that, it could be prolonged to another month or so. And at that time, they would iron all the details of peace and conditions and all that. That plan has failed. Let's let's call a spade, or there will be some further talks in
Yeah, because
Jeddah.
Putin is clearly pushing for maximalist goals, and he is unwilling to accept any kind of compromise because the Russians see compromise as mutual surrender. Therefore, they are in no mood to, or in no frame of mind to accede to any kind of agreement which would cause them to have to give up any of their maximalist goals.
Um, you know what? Sometimes in negotiations, for example, in real estate, let's see somebody sells a property, let's see you offer $400,000 for it, and the seller says absolutely not, it's impossible. Okay, fine. A week later, you submit a proposal of $360,000, and tell him that each week the price will drop another 10% or so. Now, very soon, you're going to have a very motivated seller. Maybe he will come back. Okay, it's not 400, it's now 375. How about that? Well, 375 is too much, but 355. Maybe I'll try to make it work. So here, Trump immediately cut all his possible negotiation positions, such as membership of Ukraine in NATO. This is a very undesirable option for Russia, very much, probably the most one. So why would you cut it even before the beginning of any talks, any negotiations? You would immediately say, no, no, Ukraine will never be in NATO. Why would you start with that? You say, I want peace. I want a peace between Ukraine and Russia. Here, what we're going to do, we're going to do 1 month absolute ceasefire everywhere. And during that month, if needed 2 months, we will create a map and all conditions to do that. Trump did that with Ukraine, and Ukraine didn't resist really that much. And he should have done the same thing with Russia. I really don't see what else. Now, failed to do it with Russia because Russia refused. So he must have had some cards in his sleeve to use it in case that Russia would refuse it. And Russia did. So where are all his trump cards in his sleeve? There are none. You know why? Because he, in my opinion, doesn't care much about peace between Russia and Ukraine. He uses this as the entrance to the BRICS system. He wants to be friends with Russia, China, and others, Iran. Russia will help him with that. And Ukraine is almost like a it doesn't play any significant role in this big picture what Trump is painting now. So Ukraine is a small thing. Okay, you give me Iran, China, and this and that, and Gazprom. I'll give you Ukraine. Oh, that's all yours. Something. It's like a bazaar right now. It's what I called on the last show. I think I called it Geschäft diplomacy. It's not real diplomacy. And why do you think that the man from background in New York real estate, several bankruptcies, impeachments, the criminal felony charges which sustained. Why would you believe that he is a genius of diplomacy and he can do something what majority of Americans, that's all they want. They want peace in Ukraine. They want continued help to Ukraine. Ukraine interest of Americans in increase in last couple of weeks is going ballistic. So many Americans, only I think 18% of Americans don't want to continue help to Ukraine, and 80% want to continue and even increase. Some of them, well, a lot of them, want increase help to Ukraine. So, in a sense, Trump works against majority of American people. There is something else. Now Canada joined European countries in rejecting all American products, and they will impose embargo of April 1st. And they're shelving all the plans to buy F-35 because they believe that America, if wants, they will disable them at any point they want it. And also, Pentagon denies it, but they're now saying that they're good flights. There's no doubt about that, but they're very expensive. And we can use European Gripen and Rafale and some other flights. And maybe they're not as good as, they're at least as good as F-16, that's for sure. But they're maybe in some ways not as good as F-35. But considering the difference in the quality and difference in price, maybe this is not a bad solution. And also they're using their own production that they control, and they have no doubts that it will work when needed. So, in my opinion, U.S. is the interest of Trump to create his personal empire, which will include Gazprom and Ukrainian nuclear energy, starting with Zaporizhia plant. I think they don't correspond with interests of American people. What do you think, Jonathan?
He tosses the grenade back to me. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, that is an interesting theory, but I don't think that the facts completely bear it out. And I think that right now what is happening is that the current situation is placing the onus squarely on Russia to respond or face conditions which will not enable it to win any kind of victory on the battlefield, and which will compel it to accept, at the minimum, an armistice, which will freeze things in place. Also, the Europeans are free to, for their part, well, let's say that the United States leaves NATO. Then there is nothing that would prohibit the European members of NATO to say, okay, Ukraine, we will welcome you into NATO. And if the Russians refuse to accept a ceasefire, and the United States would, because after all, President Trump is emphasizing America first, he would be taking a quasi-isolationist policy in favor of building up America's economic strength and recovery and focusing more on its internal matters. So I believe there are more issues at work here than we see on the surface. And I do not. Yeah, it's way too complex to really determine what the Trump administration's ultimate grand strategy is. About barely 3 months into the second term, so it's really one of these things. It's a work in progress, and you have to take again, as I pointed out, President Trump wants to eliminate all nuclear weapons. Well, if you want to eliminate all nuclear weapons, guess what? You have to take active measures to render them, as President Reagan termed it, impotent and obsolete. You must have a system of strategic defense, and it has to be worldwide, really, that would enable in the United States, hopefully in conjunction with its European allies, to neutralize the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, and North Korea. all at once with what I've described as wisdom, the worldwide strategic defense matrix. That is an asymmetric strategic response. Асимметрическая стратегия реагирования. An asymmetric response that would neutralize the very basis of Russia's, Chinese, and North Korean great power status, because the currency of great power status in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been possession of nuclear weapons. Right after matter of fact, right after the Persian Gulf War, which was one of the few decisive victories for the United States in the late 20th century, the Indian defense minister was asked, what was the great lesson of the Persian Gulf War to the nations of the world? And the Indian defense minister's response was, never fight the United States unless you have nuclear weapons. And so, really, the nuclear weapons as a symbol of great power status, as a means of political leverage, and really of maintaining one's relevance, nuclear weapons have been the currency of great power status in the 20th and 21st centuries. And because of that, because the recent Biden administration had adopted a strategy of being prepared to fight 3 nuclear-armed adversaries at once, and they were relying on the old mutually assured destruction paradigm, then they were therefore recommending we need to build up our nuclear arsenals. I would strongly argue against that, because building more nuclear weapons does you absolutely no good as far as influencing the perceptions and deterring your adversaries. If anything, it reinforces their belief that building more nuclear weapons is desirable. So, but if you do an asymmetric response, such as which we have the means to do, and not build any more nuclear weapons, but instead focus on neutralizing the ones that exist and maintaining the ones that you have, that is will be a much more effective response for the Trump administration in this situation for the long term, and reinforcing ballistic missile defenses for its European allies and Ukraine especially. There is nothing which prohibits the United States from doing this. So, as I said, this is still very much a work in progress, very fluid, and President Trump has demonstrated that he is very capable of shifting his position, of not reinforcing failure. If he gets opposition, he's been known to pull back and drop it or compromise or shift to another area. So his unpredictability is an asset for him, but it is a double-edged sword, and it is not something that while it can keep his adversaries off balance, it also keeps his allies off balance. And so that is the thing which both President Trump's putative allies as well as his adversaries need to keep in mind, because President Trump does use his unpredictability as an asset.
Well, I think what he's trying to do against Europe and in Canada in particularly, these countries, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years ago, it wouldn't be such a big deal because US was so dominant at that time. But today it doesn't work the same way. And in Canada, people are infuriated with the United States and Trump, and they want to completely, they want to start actually ask Americans to have visas to visit Canada, and in many cases they will reject issuing the visas, and they want to completely cut all relationship with the U.S. Europe probably is not going that far at this time, but they're not so close to U.S. as Canada either.
Sasha, you mean it's not your dream to be a doorkeeper in the Trump Tower that will be established in Ottawa, where you will greet customers and say, "Welcome to Trump Tower, glory to Emperor Trump. Here, let me take your coat." No, that's not your goal in life.
Now, John, there is contradiction. You just mentioned that Trump wants to abolish all nuclear arm in the world. Are you sure that this is in interest of United States? Because this, especially with the very potent and capable U.S. arsenal, in my opinion, it's the first, number one in the world as nuclear arms are concerned. at least very close second, but
Yeah. But,
I do believe that it's a first for
yeah.
some reason.
Well, here's why I advocate focusing on on the worldwide strategic defense matrix, because once you introduce a very strong ballistic missile defense, especially one that is space based and has an upgraded space force, you have introduced a major element of uncertainty into the strategic calculations of Russia, China, and North Korea. Yeah, once they see a strategic defense being built up, uh, some have said, "Oh, this will result in another arms race." Well, a different kind of arms race, because an offensive strategic nuclear arms race does not have any clear finish line. It has no clearly, as we've seen, it can have no clearly definable upper limit. During the Cold War, at one point, the Soviet Union and the United States had over 30,000 nuclear weapons of all kinds that they could have, and we've pulled back a great deal. However, if you, a defensive arms race does have a clearly definable finish line. If both sides are racing to construct a strong defense, if both sides have reached a point where their strategic defenses are so strong that nuclear weapons are unusable, that's your finish line. Okay, now you can actually disarm. You can easily get rid of those nuclear weapons because they're useless. And it basically takes you to a situation. It's like World War II plus.
Jonathan, you're looking a few years away from now.
Mm-hmm.
Now there is a completely different process in reality taking place. Now a lot of countries are now trying to acquire nuclear arms, nuclear
Right.
weapons. That's where direction is right now.
Mm-hmm. Because nuclear weapons are still seen as the currency of great power status.
Absolutely.
I agree
And not
absolutely.
only that, it actually, if Ukraine would have nuclear weapons, I don't think Russia would start that.
Oh no, they wouldn't have invaded at all.
So,
That was yeah.
oh, so now the process is real life is going against what Trump is dreaming about. So this also doesn't make any sense. So I mean,
that is I would argue there that is because the Trump administration's uh, both certainly its grand strategy has not been completely formulated or coherently formulated. They have not come up with a successor grand strategy to that was formulated during the Cold War by George Kennan, the containment strategy that both the Republican and Democratic parties could subscribe to, and without fear of contradiction, it would made it the strategy consistent. Unfortunately, uh, in order to have a coherent foreign policy and national security strategy, you have to have a clear concept of your grand strategy. What do you intend to accomplish over the decades in your country's future? What is your ultimate desirable end state for your country? And the United States, in the post-Cold War period, has not yet truly formulated a genuine grand strategy. That in turn affects its ability to formulate a coherent national security strategy and foreign policy. Right now, the Trump administration is reacting against the previous administration's foreign policy, which is something of an ad hoc response, but it has not yet established a coherent and consistent strategy for achieving what it wants to achieve in the 21st century. And that is a problem. Until the United States settles into a coherent strategy that prioritizes its military spending and what it spends it on, then unfortunately it runs into the U.S. military has this little phrase called full spectrum dominance. Yeah, and really, that is not a strategy. That is a bureaucratic justification for more military spending on everything. It's because
John,
what it means, it's more of everything is better.
I think there is some danger that you're underestimating. 90% of the time of what Americans talks with Russians, this is not about Ukraine. Ukraine is maybe 10%. 90% is about all kind of joint venture, bringing Russia back to G7, opening all these Russian consulates, which are nothing but spice nests. What they are. Talking about the Russian Gazprom and this and that. They're not concentrating on a peace in Ukraine. That just tells me that Ukraine is, for Trump, is a kind of a change that he will throw to Putin as long as he will achieve something significant, including his business ideas, Gazprom, and all these business ventures and deal with Iran and all that. How, Jonathan, are you realistic? How you can formulate the policy of United States when it's headed by adventurist? A person who doesn't care about interests of American people whatsoever, only his own. How can you formulate that?
You formulate that beyond the 4 years that he is in office.
So you have to still wait 3 years until this.
You have to adjust and be both the Republican Party and any of its advisors or people who are examining the potential for long-range strategy. They have to plan. They have to take into account the current Trump administration's priorities, but then they must be prepared with any subsequent administration to be able to pivot off of that and be able to modify its strategic policy accordingly. So right now you have to be you have to be pretty nimble and forward-looking in order to. You have to have various contingency plans and alternate strategies in place to be able to adjust to that appropriately. The United States had to modify even during the Cold War, with a containment strategy, with a coherent strategy. The United States had to modify its strategic doctrine, its national security strategy, in response to the growth of Soviet nuclear power. They went from massive retaliation in the 1950s to flexible response in the 1960s to realistic deterrence with the coming of the Nixon administration. That was when the Soviet Union attained nuclear parity with the United States in numbers of nuclear weapons. They adjusted to realistic deterrence. Then you had some experiments with limited nuclear options under the Ford administration with Schlesinger. And then you had what I term a dangerous reversal in the Soviet perception when President Reagan declared the Strategic Defense Initiative, which, whether or not it was a strategic bluff, it worked brilliantly because it terrified the Soviet Union leadership into thinking that they actually had a plan that, according to a KGB report, would have eventually would enable the United States to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike. Now, all of this, the United States showed flexibility during the Cold War under both Democratic and Republican administrations. And what that tells me is that regardless of which administration is in power in the future, it is still possible for the United States to adjust its national security strategy and foreign policy accordingly. So just because it looks as if on the surface that President Trump is going in one specific direction, that does not bind his successors. It does not bind whether they are Democratic or Republican. So that is and also what we are witnessing right now. We are witnessing right in the current political situation in the United States. We are witnessing what the founding fathers put in, the checks and balances system. The American government has always been a tug of war. It has never, ever been a democracy. It was not designed to be a democracy. It is a constitutional republic. It is a unique creation. It is not pure democracy because the founding fathers recognized the dangers of having a pure democracy. They feared what they called the tyranny of the majority. And so you had this. So that's why you had the creation of something called the Electoral College, something which exists nowhere else in the world. And so it has this unique set of checks that the judicial system can check the executive branch. The executive branch has its own powers. Congress, the legislative branch, has its own powers. And you have this three-way tug of war that is always going on inside the American system. And it to some in the rest of the world, it's an absolute wonder. And to others, it is an absolute mystery. But it takes place, it is ongoing, and it will never stop as long as the United States exists as a constitutional republic. Get used to it. And by the way, if you look back in American history, there have been some really vicious things done in politics, in the press and others against past American presidents. You think, people calling Trump Hitler? Oh my goodness! They were calling one of President Lincoln's cabinet officers referred to Abraham Lincoln as the original gorilla. I mean, yeah, there was some really hard shots being taken against a bunch of previous American presidents. So this is nothing new. So from my perspective, it's like watching sausage being made. It's best not to look too closely at the process.
Yeah, wait until finished product will.
Right. Wait until the finished product comes out. Wait until that beautiful dish is prepared, and you ignore all the mess that occurred before that. The pigs being slaughtered, the chickens being slaughtered.
Absolutely.
Sometimes I wonder that it's like the difference between involvement and commitment, and the difference between involvement and commitment is like the differing roles of a pig and a chicken in a ham and egg breakfast. The chicken is involved. The pig is committed.
Well done, Jonathan. Thank you so much for today's program. Have a great weekend. We'll see you Tuesday, same place, same time. Glory to Ukraine. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.